comes down to a fight between you and me, then you are doomed to lose.
Hello and welcome to Socialist Think Tank. Today we are doing something that you probably wouldn't expect on the day of a pretty shocking set of election results in mainland UK. But we're going to do something that other channels don't tend to do, which is we're tonight focusing on Northern Ireland. I think a lot of you will probably agree with us that the political education around Northern Ireland in mainland UK is absolutely appalling. So we are going to have a discussion around that tonight. It's not formal education, don't worry. We won't be just like going through a slideshow and boring you to death. We're going to talk about to real people who've lived in Northern Ireland, who care about Northern Ireland and who understand what is going on. So I'm going to start off with Sean. Can we say hello, Sean, and tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, Sean Byers. I live in Belfast and I work for Trademark, which is a trade union based organisation that works in anti-sectarianism, political education, and the new economy.
Yeah, we've interviewed Stefan
Stevie.
from. Yeah, he's that was one of our that was a really popular one, and we love what Trademark Belfast are doing. So thanks for coming on. And we've also got Stephen Baker. Hello, Stephen.
How you doing? How's it
Yeah, I'm
going?
all right. Yeah, so tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I from the outskirts of Belfast, basically. I'm a lecturer at a university. I lecture in sort of media and politics and culture. Read a couple of books, one of them about the Northern Ireland peace process and media representations, and another book about the British media and their reporting and coverage of Bloody Sunday. So that's largely my background.
Interestingly enough, that came up in my staff room today, Bloody Sunday, and everyone was just saying, "Oh, what's that? What is it?" Like, literally didn't have a clue what it was. Even like, I suppose maybe a couple of people who are into music know it from the U2 song, and that's about it. So that's that's the situation as it is. So I'm so glad you've come on to join us as well. And a lot of people will be already familiar with Tina McKay, but Tina, it's always good to have you here, and it's always good to learn something about you. So Tina.
Oh God, I'm trying to think now what else I could say, but I suppose in relation to the subject matter that we've got tonight, I could say, that I've been excommunicated from Ireland and make it sound like it's all, been some sort of scandal, but I left to come over to university, and then I've kind of never, just never moved back yet. They haven't kicked me out of England yet. They've kicked me up to Scotland for a while, and then I'll, maybe when they get tired of me, I'll go back home. But I'm a visitor now, unfortunately, but it's still home,
Well, it's always good to have you here. It's also I found it really funny before when we found out that you went to Sunderland University, so you've got the Northeast connection as well, which is nice. And Sean, you've got a Northeast connection as well, haven't you?
Yeah, my partner spent their childhood in Redcar. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to leave you out either, Stephen. You don't have a Northeast connection, do you?
No, my grandfather's from Cornwall. Other end of.
But you are in odds. You are in odds where my wife and people will know from Socialist Think Tank Laura is from. So So there is a connection there as well. We're all lovely and connected. So what's inspired this is a few of our viewers were talking about like what's going on at the moment in Northern Ireland, and Arlene Foster's resigned from the DUP. And I believe, Sean, are you going to kick us off on this one?
Yeah, I can do.
Please do.
Okay, so in the news is Arlene Foster resignation as leader of the DUP, which is the biggest unionist party in the north of Ireland. Now, Foster's resignation has been a long time in the making, I suppose. We've seen plenty of hot takes in the British and the Irish media, you know, putting this down simply down to Brexit. And you know, I've seen people in Britain in particular in the media using this issue to their own ends. But it's been a long time in the making. Foster's been the DUP leader since 2015, and her whole tenure has pretty much been a disaster. She took over from Peter Robinson in 2015, and I suppose she was seen as the person who was going to continue with the project of modernising the DUP, which has hardline and fundamentalist religious roots, dating back to its foundation by Ian Paisley in the 1960s. So she was seen as the person who was going to continue modernising the party. But as I say, her whole tenure has been a disaster. So it's been marked by the DUP's resistance to any sort of progress around social reforms, around marriage equality, around abortion liberalisation in line with the rest of the UK, resistance to an Irish Language Act. The DUP and Sinn Féin were party to an agreement in 2007 that brought them into government together, and as part of that, there was a commitment to introduce an Irish Language Act. So 15 years later, 16 years later, or no, sorry, 14, sorry, bloody maths. It hasn't happened. But in the past number of years, the DUP, including Foster, have not only resisted an Irish Language Act, but denigrated the Irish language and insulted large sections of the nationalist population. Foster struggled to contain more extreme sort of DUP figures, which have been, you've seen using outlandish sort of extreme rhetoric at times. And Foster herself was implicated in a financial scandal, which eventually brought down the executive in 2017. And the executive was suspended for 3 years. So the executive was finally restored after 3 years, but that was after some hard negotiations. So all of these factors have come into play. But of course, Brexit has been a major factor, and particularly the DUP's mishandling of Brexit. I know Steve might want to say a bit more about this, but the DUP fundamentally mistook what was the outworkings of an English Tory civil war for a more universal sort of British project of which they were an equal partner. And they mistook the fluke, I suppose, of their position as kingmaker with the Tory government as something much more meaningful and permanent, maybe. Now, Foster herself, and this is the irony of it, like Foster's opponents within the DUP were the people driving a hard Brexit strategy. They were the people who forged an alliance with the European Reform Group and with Johnson, and drove a hard Brexit strategy, when Foster herself was probably more amenable to a softer Brexit, but she went along with it. And in the end, the DUP were played like a fiddle by the ERG, by Boris Johnson, and, you know, they got their sort of, you know, their comeuppance, you know, in terms of how it's played out. So all of these factors have come into play. And what the DUP have done is they've managed to enrage Irish nationalists. They've managed to alienate more liberal pro-EU unionists. And they've at the same time sort of emboldened more hardline figures and elements within unionism. So that's their achievement over the past number of years. So in February of this year, there was a poll released that showed that the DUP was set to, there's an assembly election next year, and the poll revealed that the DUP was set to lose major ground to both the Alliance Party, the Liberal sort of centrist Alliance Party, and the TUV, which is a hardline offshoot of the DUP. Until that point, Foster was content enough with the protocol, subject to some sort of flexibilities and amendments. But there was internal pressure. She came out with more sort of inflammatory rhetoric to whip up tensions, and that was the result of that was the riots and the protests that we've seen on the ground. But it was too late for her, and her opponents within the party had already pressed the trigger in terms of trying to precipitate her ousting, and they signed a letter, and there's overwhelming opposition to Foster, so she had to go. So all those factors have come into play. Brexit has been one of them, but there's been a whole load of things happening at the same time.
And the thing is, Sean, it all started so well for her as well. Arlene Foster came into the leadership at the DUP, this incredible crest of a wave. Her background is she had been a member of the Ulster Unionist Party, would be considered a little bit more moderate than the DUP, but still very conservative. And so she'd been in that party, and then she left them with Jeffrey Donaldson because of the negotiations that led to the Good Friday Agreement. And she joined the DUP instead, and very quickly through the ranks of the DUP seemed to be anointed by Peter Robinson, their former leader. And I suspect her rise was so swift because I don't know that the DUP are a party with very much talent in it. But I can remember that in the DUP seemed to be riding high in the polls. It was that remarkable moment when they had the conference, and there was all these young men and some not so young men all gathered on the stage around her, all jumping about, singing "Arlene's on Fire." So she was kind of loved. So her fall over that sort of since then has been really spectacular. Really spectacular. That not just the misjudgments of Brexit, as Sean says, the DUP mistook that the Brexit campaign for a kind of resurgence in a kind of British imperial identity, when everybody else could see that it owed more to and was being led by English nationalists and free marketeers. Now that really matters if you live somewhere a little peripheral place like Northern Ireland, because we don't, we rely upon the British Exchequer in many ways, for a subvention. We are not going to triumph in the global free market. So the idea of hitching your star to a politics which were so clearly indebted to the free market as the Brexit thing was just utter madness. But even before that, there was the sort of things like Sean says, that series of scandals that they were marred in as well, and just incredible ineptitude. And so it's been quite a spectacular kind of fall from grace. But again, as I say, she was seen as somebody who was going to be a much more moderate, well, not a much more, just a little bit more moderate, a little bit more pragmatic politically than some of the other figures that you have in the DUP. And it's been a bit of a catastrophe, because I suspect that that moment when the DUP enter that kind of loose coalition with Theresa May's Conservatives, that's probably the first time that an English audience I've caught a glimpse of the DUP. Yeah. I've caught a glimpse of what we've been living with here for so long. They are a kind of unionist Taliban in some respects. Yeah. They're that bad. So, I mean, this is the party when we were growing up that used to tie up the swings in parks on a Sunday. The party that put picket lines on pubs when you wanted to go in and have a drink on a Sunday and stuff like this. So, there's a very deep sort of religious fundamentalism about them. Foster was seen as being sort of slightly different from that, but it's been a bit of a catastrophe. And the question is now really what the party does next. Does it elect Jeffrey Donaldson, who's, as I say, defected from the Ulster Unionist Party with Arlene Foster? Do the DUP go back to another UUP blow-in, or do they go for the more traditional Edwin Poots, who his family's roots are in the DUP from its foundations when Ian Paisley put it together? So this is going to be interesting.
I think it's really interesting. The thing for me is that, I think that, the writing was on the wall a long time ago for the DUP, and I think in particular for Arlene. And I think what they failed to do was see, the inevitable. And I think that for, especially for me being, out of the north, and I'm looking in now, and I look around, and people don't care about the DUP here. In fact, people don't even care about the north over here either, because they're too, busy with their own concerns and the sort of swaying nationalism that that's growing here. But I think that the DUP, and I think for a lot of unionists in the north as well, don't understand that people do not care about them. They're an irrelevance to the rest of Britain. Britain doesn't need the north, doesn't want the north, and they don't even understand what's going on. Hence the fact we're having, a bit of this conversation tonight. But the fact that they couldn't see that, we have Paul, we say this all the time, never trust a Tory. The fact that has not seemed to have come across, that, they just swallowed the lies that came from Boris Johnson and, the Conservative Party, that, oh yes, you're important to us, we'll not, cut you loose. The North will not be, any different to the rest of Britain. And, they actually believe this. And everybody else, I mean, I know, people that I know from the North over here, we were going, I can't believe they're swallowing this. They're going to discard them at any opportunity. And the moment that the election, happened, and, Boris Johnson increased his vote share, well, the DUP were an irrelevance, and they've been, shown up to be as much. And how they couldn't see any of this coming, I just don't know. And it's dire. And I think the one thing that, makes me laugh, and I know I shouldn't, but what made me laugh today was because I was thinking about us coming on this, and I thought, were Arlene Foster and Keir Starmer, having the same focus groups? Because they seem to have gone for the same approach. They've both alienated every element possible that they need, for success, on an electoral platform. And, it's quite alarming, that they both need, or Arlene has no opportunity now, but the DUP and the Labour Party are missing one key thing in their strategy, and they're not listening to the people. So when they're going to replace leaders, or they're going to do a new strategy, don't do that navel gazing and do it from within. Go and listen to the people. And, it seems like to me, it's a very simple thing to do, that would be the first thing that you would think of doing. Well, we represent the people, let's go and listen to them,
I think that's the first, we discussed beforehand how we were going to do this, and we're like, how do we do this? Because the history of Northern Ireland's so rich, and there's so many different aspects to it, and we were talking about maybe doing a historical aspect first, and then coming into it, well, we could just speak about history forever. So what we decided to do was kind of have flashbacks in there. And I think the first flashback, and Tina, you'll know that people here just really, when the DUP came into that coalition arrangement with Theresa May, or the supply and whatever it was, supply and demand, or whatever they called it, confidence and supply. That was on. They went into the confidence and supply arrangement with.
There was no demand.
Yeah, it wasn't. Well, they got a bit of money though, didn't they? But
a hell of a bit of money.
You know what? That was the first time a lot of people had heard of them, and people were like, "Oh, no, who are the DUP?" And I think my first thing that I said was, "Oh, they're the dinosaur deniers," and people were like, "You what?" So can we explain? The first flashback is, who are the DUP? Why do they exist? And what do they believe in? And I guess that can go to anyone.
I'll just go very quickly, because I feel like I'm sitting with two, much more intelligent experts than me, and yourself, Paul, of course. But whenever people used to ask me who are the DUP, because there had been a Louis Theroux documentary on the Westboro Baptist Church. So that was kind of like the closest thing that I could, relate them to. So I used to say, yeah, they're the Westboro Baptist Church, but on acid. They're absolutely worse than the Westboro Baptist Church. But they are that kind of, it is that fundamentalist aspect. But I just think that they're, I shouldn't laugh, because there are so, it is they are a credible-ish party. They do command a lot of support. They are actually the leading party currently, but what they believe, it's just astounding that we're 2021, and it's just unbelievable. But yeah, I shouldn't joke too much. I'll leave it to the serious minds to educate the people.
Do you want to have a go at the history, Sean?
I'll have a start. Well, look, like I'm sure as most people know, like the 1960s was a time of tumult, like I suppose, activism, the emergence of the civil rights movement, and of course, like eventually you had the outbreak of the Troubles in 1969. In response, I suppose, to the civil rights movement and some of the demands that were being made at the time, there emerged this firebrand sort of preacher, Ian Paisley, who had a decent following, but not a substantial following. And Paisley emerged, I suppose, as a reaction to the civil rights movement, as a reaction to the mobilization of the nationalist community for equality, and in reaction to any moves that were being made by some of the more moderate elements within official unionism in government to accommodate some of those reforms that were being demanded. So he emerged in that sort of environment against that backdrop, and the DUP was eventually established from that. It had a base in the Free Presbyterian Church, which is an extreme sort of hardline right-wing fundamentalist philosophy. It was exclusively Free Presbyterian, and I suppose the guiding principle of the DUP was just like, the no surrender type of attitude, not 1 inch to give to the nationalist community or any sort of demand for reform. And he was successful in undermining the unionist government at the time, the Prime Minister Terence O'Neill, who went some way but not far enough to try to accommodate some of the demands that the civil rights movement were making. But he faced the revolt from within his own party, and he faced pressure from Paisley and the supporters, and that eventually proved to be his undoing. And of course, the UVF emerged at the same time as that. But that's the time that the DUP emerged. And throughout their history, they were the naysayers. They were the people who resisted any effort at different points of time. They resisted efforts to try to bring about a political resolution to the conflict. Even attempts to institute some sort of form of power sharing between the two main communities. And they resisted all of those efforts over the course of history until 2007, whenever Paisley, who was still the DUP leader, and it became First Minister, agreed to enter into sort of bury the axe with their erstwhile enemies, the Sinn Féin, and enter into government with Sinn Féin, which is like just a remarkable turnout for the books. But that's their history. It was no, and then yes, okay. But that was they only agreed to enter into government once they had totally destroyed David Trimble and the Ulster Unionist Party, who had been signatories to the Good Friday Agreement in the first place, and one of the architects of the Good Friday Agreement. They destroyed them first, and then they agreed to enter into government in 2007, and that's what led to 10 years of power sharing, on and off between the DUP and Sinn Féin.
I think unionism baffles people outside of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and it's maybe worth trying to explain a little bit about what it actually is, and how it kind of thinks. I mean, the thing about unionism is you've always got to qualify anything you're going to sort of say by pointing out that unionism is very diverse. There are people who consider themselves to be liberals and moderate unionists, and progressive unionists, and unionists who would see themselves as both socialists and unionists as well. Now, the thing is that there are three unionist parties represented in the Northern Ireland Assembly, and they're all just different shades of conservatism. So even though you've got these liberal, moderate, and progressive unionists, they don't really have any particular voice at all. So it's very difficult to tell how many there are because they have so little representation. So, then as I said, you got that kind of variety. But I think the interesting thing is, and I think one of the reasons why people don't understand unionism is because Irish nationalism and Irish republicanism are easy to get. They're nationalists. They want a sovereign nation, and that's comprehensible because the world's full of people who live in nations. And so that makes sense. But what do unionists want? What do they actually want? It's sort of the baffling language which unionism very often uses. So one of the very common slogans you'll hear from unionists is Ulster is British. For God and Ulster, Ulster is British, and Ulster clearly isn't British. It's on another island, and even there are even 9 counties of Ulster which are not included within Northern Ireland. So what does it mean when somebody says Ulster is British? Well, loyalists and unionists know exactly what they mean when they say Ulster is British. And in many respects, what they're talking about is a province of their imagination. And that's not to sort of say that it doesn't have potency and it doesn't mean something very much, but it is a province of their imagination, which in many respects is exclusively Protestant. That's what it is. And that's the kind of ideal. It's a kind of ideal that they hold to. So like you said earlier on there, Tina, we sort of said, why don't unionists understand that that people in England don't want them? Mm-hmm. That does not matter to Ulster unionists, not one bit, because what they're loyal to is this ideal, mm-hmm. that ideal. And the problem is for the English, you let them down. You sold out that ideal on them. Maybe you're not loyal to it any longer because maybe you're not sufficiently English or not sufficiently British any longer, but they've held fast to that ideal. So in a way, that's a very different politics from a nationalist politics or just politics of the nation. And that's why I think sometimes unionism just looks incomprehensible to people who don't live here. And I think it's also probably sometimes why it gets easy to mock because it just looks so out of step with what everybody else is doing. But it has its own internal logic that makes sense to people who are unionists and who are loyalists also.
So, that's incredibly interesting. I'm sure people have learned loads from that. But I'm sort of building to a question that Ruth Davidson asked. But I thought that it's better
Ruth
that
Davidson?
people had not the Ruth Davidson, definitely not. She's one of our members. So she definitely a lot more to the left of that Ruth Davidson. Although that Ruth Davidson's probably a lot to the left of the DUP and the Conservative Party. But anyway, so we're building into this question, and you might be able to see it in the chat yourselves there. But I think it's probably important now because the other side of the coin is probably Sinn Féin in this. Now, I've knocked doors for the Labour Party and stuff, and I've heard that not only Jeremy Corbyn spoke to Sinn Féin, but I've also heard people saying that Jeremy Corbyn was in the IRA and also a pacifist, which is kind of one of the weirdest contradictions I've ever heard. But people genuinely believe this, and this is how remarkable I think people's ideas around what's going on in Northern Ireland are. So can you explain what Sinn Féin is and where they stand at the moment? So the history of Sinn Féin and where they are now.
Sean's a history buff.
So briefly, I suppose Sinn Féin historically has been seen as the political wing of the IRA historically, and I suppose the armed struggle of the IRA, the IRA's armed campaign, took precedence up until around 1981 with the hunger strikes, and the effect of the hunger strikes was to there's obviously 10 men died during the hunger strikes. People have heard of Bobby Sands and so on. The effect of the hunger, and Bobby Sands was elected during that time as an MP with a massive vote in Fermanagh, South Tyrone. And that was of huge sort of significance, because what that said to the Republican movement was that there was a potential electoral base for their project. There was a potential political outlet for the project, and that was coming at a time when they were sort of starting to see that the armed struggle itself maybe wasn't going to achieve their ultimate objective of United Ireland, or certainly not as soon as they had as immediate as they had hoped. So that sort of hunger strike moment was a big turning point for the Republican movement as a whole. And I suppose that's the point at which you can see Sinn Féin becoming more prominent, the political strategy becoming more prominent. And of course that developed over time. Sinn Féin grew its support base. It eventually, the IRA declared a ceasefire in 1994. Short of the Republican movement's objectives of British withdrawal, but that it was the compromise that the Republican movement had to make at the time, faced with a sort of stalemate in terms of the military campaign. Sinn Féin, as a consequence, supported the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. At that time, it was still the second political force in Irish nationalism. The SDLP were still the biggest political force. But in the decade that followed that, Sinn Féin really managed to steal the SDLP's clothes, I suppose, and hegemonize the SDLP and become the biggest nationalist party in the North, to the point that they're sort of approaching the point of utter sort of dominance in terms of nationalist politics in the North. So that's Sinn Féin. In terms of where they stand, it's interesting, because Sinn Féin pulled the plug on the executive in 2017, and that was due to building pressure from within their own support base, that they had made a lot of concessions through successive talks processes, and still the DUP wasn't keeping to its word, and the Irish Language Act was one of the big issues. Sinn Féin was pressured by its own support base and by wider society to do something about it, and pulling the plug was sort of the last resort, but they did that. Sinn Féin need Northern Ireland, and it's strange, but Sinn Féin need Northern Ireland to work for their own political strategy, and I expand on that a wee bit later if you want me to. But they need Northern Ireland to work for their own political strategy. So they would ideally like to see things back up and running, and a sense of stability, political stability. But whether we're going to get that anytime soon, is down to what happens to the DUP.
Good question there in the sidebar from Maureen about where Sinn Féin, the original political party for Southern Ireland, going back early 1900s. I mean, when we were talking before we come on, we sort of said, God, let's not do the history, let's not do the history. But, because that sort of question leads you in. That's a really good question, actually, Maureen. And it leads you into a kind of a debate about, well, okay, with the Irish Parliamentary Party, back around the time of Home Rule, and they kind of overtaken by Sinn Féin, and then you got the Irish Civil War, and it emerges out of that as Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and and it's I think that the one of the reasons perhaps why Irish politics and Northern Irish politics looks kind of incomprehensible from the other side of the Irish Sea is because it's very difficult to map on the kind of left-right politics of the UK on the Ireland. It's politics here are set up around civil wars and different and constitutional arrangements. So it's a really good question, but it's another one for Sean, really, isn't it?
I think it's fair to say there's been different manifestations of Sinn Féin. The 1905 one, the one of the revolutionary period, a different incarnation since then. But the Sinn
A
Féin.
bit like the Labour Party in a sense.
But I suppose there's no real historical thread tying the Sinn Féin in 1905 to the Sinn Féin of today. But the Sinn Féin we see now is that which has existed for the duration of the Troubles.
So when you say that there's no link now, so is Sinn Féin like kind of, did they re-emerge, or did they like kind of take inspiration from the Sinn Féin of the 1900s? Is that what's going on here? Because I'm not 100% sure on this one.
There is a thing within Irish republicanism about claiming the mantle and invoking tradition, so historical continuity, and saying that we are the original. We can draw our lineage back to the original forefathers of republicanism, and certainly to the forefathers of 20th century republicanism. So there is a big thing about tradition and historical lineage and different Republican organizations will lay claim to the mantle of different organizations, different historical figures. Conley, for example. Everyone lays claim to Conley, and Sinn Féin's one example. They will say that they will claim that they can trace their roots back to 1905 in Sinn Féin, and they are the same party, but in fact they're not. That Sinn Féin fell away. The Sinn Féin that emerged after that, the revolutionary Sinn Féin, fell away, and as Steve has said, fell away into Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. And it was only later that Sinn Féin re-emerged as a coherent sort of political force. And then you had the outbreak of the Troubles. You had a Republican split between two different factions of Republicanism. So you had two Sinn Féins emerge. But the Sinn Féin that exists today is that which is historically tied to the provisional IRA that existed throughout the Troubles.
So Tina, you're laughing there. Like, why is this? It's just the ridiculousness of the situation, maybe, or
no, just more, because we were talking about, before we came on, how, if we started on one thing, it would just kind of grow legs and we'd just go further and further. And I was laughing when that question came on because I could see where this was going to go, and I thought this is just going to go on. And also the I think I just laugh at the, and the traditional, when we talk about the traditional things, it just makes me think of how wedded we are to things that really, have no impact, really, no material impact, or, on how we exist as a class, as people, in our daily lives. And, I've kind of just been thinking about some of the books that I've read, throughout this conversation, listening to both Stephen and Sean, and thinking, the two particular books that come to mind. And one of them is Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson, and the other being Banal Nationalism, which, if you haven't read that, by Michael Billig, is one of the, I know Stephen you will have, because I did it through the course I did at uni, and it's one of the books that stuck with me because it just reminded me so much of the situation, growing up, flags, just nonsense that we're seeing now, in Britain, how it masquerades as your identity, as something to cling to, when it really doesn't make a difference to your daily life. And that's, sometimes I laugh a bit when I get nervous as well, or laugh whenever I see similarities with things. And I just think that's why, to me, that the sort of this program talking about the North and the history of it is so relevant to where we are today. And I mean, I'm sitting, talking to you in Scotland, where there's a huge debate, as we know at the moment, where there's just a focus constantly on a border poll and will they become independent. And this is unfortunately what I see as being the future for the North for the next God knows how many years, when, the focus will be on something like the SNP have done here, focus constantly on one issue and ignore the rest, which is what's going to happen, I think, is what Sinn Féin are going to do. over the next, few years are going to focus on this one issue, which will then completely take up all the time, all the effort, all the energy, and all the attention, especially within the media, on away from the issues of, the ordinary people, the working class people. And I just think that, I saw the day that Arlene resigned, I saw there was the correspondent in Belfast was talking to, wasn't actually, sorry, was it, what it was, no, it was the partition 100th anniversary of the North. And they were in West Belfast there were people marching as per usual, in their little housing areas. And, it was quite sad. I was listening to one of the residents who was speaking to the reporter saying that, Arlene had to go because, and it just goes back to Sean's conversation earlier about Sinn Féin, about because they'd conceded too much, they'd given too much to the other side, and that, the working class people needed, the DUP to, continue working for them. And I was astounded by this because I just thought, the DUP aren't working for you. No party in the North is working for the working class. And, I just started to think about this whole border issue, and I thought nothing is going to change until, the people grasp the opportunity. And I do think that this is, if Sinn Féin play this right, have a massive opportunity to open up their electoral politics to all demographics in the North if they focus on class conditions, if they focus on, the social conditions that people are living in, and maybe talk less about a flag, maybe talk less about wanting a border poll, and talk about the issues that, that are fundamental to people's lives. So social housing, job security, all these things are important, whether you're Catholic or Protestant, or whether you're in between, or whether you believe in nothing, they're all the same. So it shouldn't matter. And I just think that, while we have focused a little bit on the history, I think the political parties in the North can focus too much time on the history and miss the opportunity that they have to change, the landscape of things, and really change people's lives. And I just think that there's a huge opportunity, even, if they do, succeed in getting the border poll, in what sort of Ireland that they're going to create for the ordinary people. But they're going to miss a trick if they remove the ordinary people from those conversations.
I think I stood as a Labour coalition candidate here back in 1996, and I was much younger then, obviously, and part of it was, what you wanted to do was to go and put an offer to voters and say, look, vote on these bread and butter issues. Here's the things that we care about: National Health Service, jobs, welfare, education, things like that. And it never cuts through. It's always trumped by the constitutional question, and it's one which I hold my hands up. I've tried to avoid talking about for many years, just because it's just a can of worms you just don't want to open. You don't want to have to do that. And I've come to the conclusion, reluctantly, that it just can't be avoided any longer. It can't be avoided, and it can't be avoided for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that actually constitutional settlements really matter. Mm-hmm. And they matter because that's the framework within which you will try to advance your other aims and objectives: social economic objectives around women's rights, environmental sustainability. Those you will try to advance it through a particular type of constitutional settlement. And the constitutional settlement that exists at the moment within the UK doesn't work. It doesn't work for anybody in Scotland. I don't know if it works for people in England that well, although they seem to be happy enough to vote for Boris Johnson. And I don't know whether it's going to work for Wales forever, but it certainly doesn't work here in the north of Ireland. Now, the fact that the UK's constitutional settlement should be redundant is not necessarily an argument for a united Ireland. It might be, but not necessarily, because there's no historical inevitability. But the experience of living here is that you exist in a constitution where it doesn't matter what we vote for, we get what English voters want, And so those election results, and I'm sure people in Scotland feel the same, those election results that sort of confirm that English voters want to vote for a liar like Boris Johnson, a charlatan like Boris Johnson, if that's what where England is at the moment, what do we do? How long do we wait? Because in terms of, and just numerically, there are more English people within the United Kingdom than Scots, Irish, and Welsh put together. Do we just put our politics on hold? And I think those are the kind of questions that are coming to the fore now. And it's interesting to look at Scottish nationalism, because Scottish nationalism is not a politics, or the Scottish National Party, sorry, is not a party of blood and belonging. It's a civic nationalism that it's advancing. So it's about the fact that Scotland can't do the things that Scotland, which looks sort of more social democratic in its political complexion than England does. And so what do you do? That constitution has to change or break at some point. And I think something similar to the point you make about Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin's history, because of the violence of the Republican movement, probably makes it very difficult for it now to make a kind of more secular offer to Northern Protestants who are perhaps disillusioned with unionist politics. So Sinn Féin might not be the vehicle that brings Northern Protestants along. Something else might be the thing that does that. But certainly, this is the thing. If you're going to speak to the national question as it exists here now, then it is better done in terms of, we will produce a more robust and representative, richer democracy. And what we're promising also are kind of social and economic conditions, which would be much more favourable to the ones you have at the moment. Two things have to come together in that respect, because nobody is going to vote to be poorer, I don't think. Nobody will do that,
Well, they did. Yeah. They do tend to do that in England, though. But I think, I think you're right. The two things do come together. But I just have a feeling that Sinn Féin are just going to focus on that one issue, that border pool issue. They're not really going to look at the material conditions that people are living in. That's my fear. That's where I don't think they will talk about the other issues, the bread and butter issues that really, matter to people's lives. And I think it would be a huge miss. And I think, I was talking to my dad about this the other night. And I was saying that the one thing that, because I obviously haven't been away and been involved, temporarily, should I say, within Labour Party politics, is that one of the things that I thought was and should be at the root of what Labour should be doing, in England, is the community organising project, which is, really everything should be at localised level, embedded in communities and helping communities empower themselves, to create the change that they need. And that in turn then leads to electoral success, which in some way Sinn Féin used to do, but they did it in a more cynical way, which was more about sort of winning those votes quicker. That would help in certain things. But that's where I think they could take that element that, was discarded by, Sir Keir Starmer. And that's the way to bring those two issues together, which is to talk about, like you say, how how they could offer, through the change in the nation state, could offer a change in their material lives. But I just don't know whether they have that. And I was saying to my dad, this is what they should do. That's the kind of thing they should be doing, but whether they actually do that is another thing. I think political parties just look too much to the short term. It's what can we do in the short term to get us these votes, rather than that long-term plan of, okay, well, if we start here, this is the end goal. How do we get there? And how, we'll do whatever it takes, to get to that point.
Yeah, can I just come in this one? Oh, yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah, I think, just to echo what the two of you said, I think we talked about the crisis of Ulster unionism, but what we're looking at as well is the long and continuing crisis of the British state, of the UK. We've seen a long sort of process where economic and political power has been concentrated in the core, which is England and specifically London. And that's been at the expense of the periphery. It's been at the expense of Northern Ireland. It's been at the expense of Scotland, Wales, and even parts of the north of England. the Tories and Labour arrived at a neoliberal consensus. I mean, you yourselves have seen that there's hardly a bit of paper between the Tories and Labour in terms of their policies at the moment, and I mean that has been the case for Corbynism was a sort of
blip in the matrix.
It was a blip. Yeah, over the past 20, 30 years, Labour and the Tories have been on the same page in terms of that there's only one economic model, and there's only one way of organising the economy, and there is an alternative, and that's sort of fueled this disintegration of the British state. So Brexit is a symptom of that, of course, and it's been a sort of accelerant in terms of the impact it's had on the different regions of the UK. I mean, I think Corbyn, if you look at the lay of the land now, like a Corbyn government probably would have granted the UK a stay of execution for a while. But that didn't happen. That moment's gone. Like, it's really depressing to look into the future. Like, and I mean, I think we could be looking at another decade of Tory rule. The way the elections are going, the absolute state of the Labour Party, there is no alternative in existence. And not only are the Tories going to make things worse materially for the regions, but they've shown that they're only too happy to use the different regions of the UK as a pawn for their own games. I mean, Johnson's still at it. If you look at it now, they have plans now to prohibit any attempt to prosecute British soldiers for their actions in the north of Ireland, which is going to be a fucking catastrophe here, like, if that goes through.
Yeah.
And it does just shore up the idea that the Tories do not give a shit about this place, other than just to use the north as a pawn for Westminster politics. But that comes back to the sort of constitutional and political framework that we're with, that we have. I mean, like, even if we were to elect here in the north, if we were to elect 90 out of 90 MLAs as socialists, the reality still is that the northern institutions are glorified county council. All of the major decisions affecting the north are made by English politicians who are drawn from a very narrow class of people and who have no real concern for this place. So even if we're like a whole cohort of socialists, we'd be very limited by the political framework and the constitutional framework that we have. Sinn Féin, like, I mean, I've been very critical of Sinn Féin in the past, but if you look at Sinn Féin in the south, they've gained substantial support, considerable support, and it's not because of their past as such, and it's not because of their position in the constitutional question, although that's a factor, but it's because the south of Ireland is in the midst of a health and housing crisis, and it's an economic fucking basket case, and Sinn Féin have the most progressive and convincing policies on those issues, and they've appealed to a whole generation of younger people. And in fairness to Sinn Féin, during the first stint in government with the DUP, 10 years, that was forged on a neoliberal consensus of low taxes, FDI, low wages, hollowing out the public sector, all of that stuff. Like, they had a consensus on the economy. But I think, in fairness, Sinn Féin had learned their lesson from that experience. And if you just look at an example, the New Decade, New Approach Agreement, that was signed by the DUP and Sinn Féin in 2020, and that provided the basis for the restoration of the institutions here. That's a lot of really good stuff in there, like about a Green New Deal and like climate transformation and workers' rights and like a whole raft of stuff. And it's like, it didn't come from the fucking DUP, I can tell you that. You know, it came from Sinn Féin, because of the pressure they've come under, because I think they recognise that they fucked up in the first 10 years they were in government, and they recognise, and this is what comes back to, I was saying earlier on, they need Northern Ireland to work, because their political project rests on them being in government, north and south, and showing that they can deliver for the majority of people. So they've adopted policies and presented a programme on that basis. But the blockage in this is the political and constitutional framework. They come up with a massive wish list in the form of this new agreement of all sorts of wonderful things they were going to do with the economy and to improve people's lives, without any sort of financial commitment or support from the British government. So all they were left with was a document that wasn't worth the paper it was written on. And there's no fucking way that the Tory government, and certainly not this crop of Tories, are going to provide the investment and support that is needed to deliver on any of those promises to improve working class people's lives. So I have to agree with Steve that it can't be avoided anymore. I mean, I think there are things that can be done to improve life here. I mean, full implementation of the Good Friday Agreement would be a start. There's lots of good stuff in there about a human rights bill and a civic forum and different things like that. But in terms of material conditions and actually, you know, making a decent fist of things and addressing the major crises that are in front of us, the political framework is a major block.
Can I ask? Sorry, Stephen. No, I was just going to ask a really, really quick one, and then please do go on. Stephen. It's like, how does it feel when you have successive Conservatives who are wheeled out as Northern Ireland minister, and they're like, oh, well, I haven't read the Good Friday Agreement, and you just think, well, you know, I know the Good Friday Agreement isn't the be-all and end-all of Irish politics, but you should at least, like, if that's your brief, you should at least read 36 pages. You know, that should be a bare minimum. How does it feel for people? Are people bothered about that? Do the people think, geez, they don't care at all, they couldn't care less about us? Or do they just crack on and ignore it? Because, like, you've had Dominic Raab said that, and, you know, all these obscure people that I can't remember the names of who they put as Northern Irish minister, because it's like, oh, well, you just be Northern Irish minister, you know, it's like kind of, you know, it's like being the, you know, in charge of the tea or something, isn't it, for them? They're not bothered. But, like, how does it feel?
I suppose it's I don't know about how you feel yourselves, Tina and Sean, but I don't expect anything more. And that's an awful thing. I don't expect anything more. I mean, occasionally, I think, you know, looking back, I thought, you know, Mo Molan was somebody who clearly put a tremendous amount of time and effort in here. And I think she deserves a lot of credit, you know. But really, I don't know that you expect much more from them. I mean, I was gonna say, you know, that that question of the settlement that we need, and I think, and this is why I think it's important not to isolate Northern Ireland from everywhere else in the UK at the moment, because it really is a question for everybody, I think, and particularly people in England on the left. After the last election, I was driving over to an election count in Bangor in County Down here, and the exit poll came out, and it said, look, this is a huge majority for the Conservative Party. And I nearly put the fucking car off the road. I was so distressed by this news. You know, I was heartbroken. And I arrived over into the count in Bangor, where there was a number of Conservative, there was one Conservative candidate and his supporters. The Conservatives very often put up people for election here. Very often they don't come from here. They're kind of flown in, you know, helicoptered in here, and it's kind of go over to Ulster and see how you get on over there, and if you come back and you're unbruised, we'll give you a safe seat here or something. But anyway, I got over and I wanted to go and rip the head of a Conservative. I couldn't bear it any longer, and I come back and I was I was despairing, and I sat down and I began to go. I went back through my life. I did a kind of biography, And I began to calculate for how much of my life I have lived under conservative governments. And there's a brief moment, in my adult life when I'm politically conscious, when Tony Blair gets elected. But I look at that now and I sort of think Blair got elected basically because the Conservatives were exhausted, politically all over the place, needed time to regroup, and Blair was given permission, by Rupert Murdoch and others. Your turn. You look after this until the Tories are in better shape. And then the Tories are back in again in 2010. And as Sean says, it looks like we can look forward into the future and we can look forward to continuous tour. This is a one-party state. Mm-hmm. And the only chance of getting an alternative government is one which is almost given permission by a kind of ruling class to take up that role. That's not good enough for anybody here. It's not good enough for people in England. It's not good enough for people in Scotland or Wales, and it's not good enough for people here either. And so that has to be looked at. If somebody put up in the chat earlier on was sort of asking about a book to read, Tom Nairn's The Breakup of Britain, written in 1977. Now, it's dated in many respects, but this is a book written in 77, which really begins to demolish the British state as it is at the moment, because any state that can't produce governments of any variety, you got to question how democratic it is at all. It's only nominally democratic. So I don't think this is good enough for any of us living on these islands. And I think that needs a conversation amongst all of us. And that's why I think tonight's important to sort of, so the people in England and elsewhere can hear that in some respects, this settlement that we're stuck in at the moment, we all have very, very similar frustrations about it.
I think the other thing, just to add to that, Stephen, I think, you're, as always, you're 100% correct. And I could listen to you all night about it. But I think, for me, when because I've been thinking about this so much, and obviously to reiterate your dismay and disappointment and heartache at the last election, I was a candidate for the Labour Party in that election. So whenever that exit poll came out, I was very much in a similar state. But I think most recently, when we've been sort of looking at the detail of the police crime, and is it the police crime commissioning bill, whatever the official title is for it?
Victims maybe thrown in there,
But a hell of a lot's thrown in there. But I think people have I've been having conversations with a variety of people about that, and some kind of people are very much aware of what that could lead to, and some people are just really like, they just wouldn't do these kind of things. And that's why I think this conversation that we're having about the North is really, really important. And I think that it's really important for people to understand the context of the North and what the British state has done to the North. Because if people don't think that these things can happen that are in that bill, they need to very quickly understand what's happened to us in the North and how we've been treated and how we continue to be treated. Because there sometimes is this feeling, I think, and I think we're in the middle of it now, it's certainly in England, where people look at the Tories as being the responsible people in government who would never do anything bad to them, even though queues at food banks are phenomenal, and the housing crisis is like something we've never seen. All these things are happening. They still somehow have this notion that they'll be protected. That the government, even through the coronavirus pandemic, but they've been doing their best. They're looking after us while they're siphoning off billions of public money, and in broad daylight, And I think for me, that's why another reason why I think the rest of Britain, or the rest of the UK, really need to get to grips with what's happened and how. And I suppose that comes back to my sort of always my dismay at how the unionists within the North are still so and I know what you said, Stephen, and why they're attached to the imaginary ideal, but in the reality of it, how they could still feel so attached to something that is just something inherently so bad for them as well. And I think that there's a lot of learning, and I know there's so many areas that we haven't covered and could cover, but I do think that it is a subject that maybe people that aren't aware really should get aware of very quickly, because not only should you never trust a Tory, but the establishment itself is only ever going to work for the establishment. It's never going to work for us ordinary folk.
I think that's a point I would love to put to liberal, moderate, and progressive unionists and unionists to see themselves as socialists. I know a number of them over here who are very, very hostile to Boris Johnson, and they have they have a set of social and economic policies that they would love to see implemented that I'm down with. I think brilliant. Let's go for that. But the thing is, and I wonder at what stage the penny drops. Yeah. You can't have those things that you want, because you can have what England votes for, and you'll just have to like it, and if you don't like it, what are you going to do about it? That's a kind of key question. That goes back again what was said earlier on. If the framework doesn't work, if it doesn't allow you to pursue the sort of social and economic objectives that you have, then you've got to look at it. And at the moment, we're in a framework where if you want to do anything remotely progressive at all, if you want to put forward even what Corbyn put forward at the last election, the election before, which was should have been a fairly uncontroversial social democratic program, monstered for it. If you can't even put that before people without being treated like you're some kind of pariah, there is something wrong, and alarm bells should be ringing. So for those people who sort of say, we'll just keep going, and I know that there's that sort of question. I think somebody put it up in the chat there about, do you split? Do you form another party? Do you do something else? I don't know what the answer to that is in England, but I don't know to what extent you can. I mean, I when I was 16 years old, I wrote to the British Labour Party and asked if I could join, and they wrote back to me and they said, no, we don't recruit in the north of Ireland, but you can join our sister party, the Social Democratic and Labour Party, the SDLP, who are a fairly conservative party, actually. You can do a donation if you like, and here's a poster of Neil Kinnock. That's how long ago it was. So I put the poster of Neil Kinnock up on my wall. So I've always been part of it. I would always been very, very reluctant to ever split that in a sense. But I think it might be getting to the sort of stage where you've got to sort of sit down and sort of say, is this the vehicle that'll get us to there? And if it isn't, then that again, and that might be something that English comrades need to start thinking about.
I think it's actually quite interesting because, very neatly you've kind of segued into something that is, about the Labour Party. But I think it's actually the issue that the Labour Party is facing is exactly the issue that the whole of the UK is facing, and the North within it. That it's the structure, it's the system of it, and if you have a system that isn't going to allow you to get the things that you need, you need to find a way of either changing that system or you need to rebuild another one. Which it comes to your point of, is the Labour Party, is it the vehicle that that working class people can get to achieve the socialist policies and the equality and all the things that that we as working class people, and on the left in particular, are looking to achieve. And so I think I've come full circle in my feeling on the Labour Party, and I just don't think it's the vehicle. I think it's shown through what happened with Jeremy Corbyn that what they will do if somebody goes off track. And I think that maybe that's a conversation for another evening, but I do think it's quite interesting that it mirrors the actual situation of the UK as a whole, and it's in the system that it works in.
Just to answer the question there, Sean, do you think the South can afford us?
Yeah,
there's the $1 million question, literally.
There's a lot of talk about. It's a boring question to answer. It's not a question. It's an interesting question, but it's a boring one to answer. It has a boring answer. There's a lot of talk about the subvention. Like the North doesn't look like a viable economic entity, like the other peripheral parts of the UK. It receives a fiscal transfer. Like it's standard practice across the UK. But as to whether the South can absorb us, like the South of Ireland is an extremely wealthy country. Like, it's an extremely wealthy country. It could easily absorb the North's true fiscal deficit, which people have worked out to be actually around 2 billion, something like that. So it's not the 10 billion that is often quoted. because that takes into account, British debt repayment and all sorts of stuff like. But so the 2 billion could easily be absorbed, and I think it'd be quite straightforward to make the economic case for United Ireland. Like the North has been in long-term structural economic decline, as has the rest of the UK. Like, as I said, the South could easily absorb the North. There's a need for a new economic model on the island, to address the major crises they're facing, including the climate crisis. There's the border regions that have suffered from decades of peripherality, neglect, underinvestment due to partition, due to the very existence of the border, which needs to be addressed. And in a United Ireland, they would be front and centre of any economic programme. So the economic case would be fairly straightforward to make, and that'll be part of the job. Like, it'd be part of Sinn Féin's job, but to address something you said, Steve, like, I think Sinn Féin will have to be part of the solution. They're the biggest working class party on the island, and I don't think we have time to build another one, but it's going to have to be a much broader coalition of civil society, community interests, trade unions, and so on, in which Sinn Féin are a partner. But the economic case will be fairly straightforward to make, and that'll be part of the job. But there's no economic determinist argument for United Ireland. There's lots of other issues that have to be, and fears and concerns that have to be addressed, not just amongst the unionist population, but that sort of growing other category. The new communities, the people who don't identify as British or Irish or Protestant or Catholic, and it's going to be a very complex sort of process.
So that brings us into something I'm really, really interested in talking about, which is we are on Socialist Think Tank, and in terms of left and right politics, there you've kind of said that Sinn Féin are probably, I guess, the most left. So where do we stand on Northern Ireland with regards to like left and right politics, with socialist politics and stuff? Because Tina mentioned earlier on, and actually all of you have mentioned on about the neoliberal basis of everything in Northern Ireland as well, and also the South isn't particularly socialist either, is there? So, like, with regards to socialist coalition, I believe that we need to stick together as socialists, like across borders and all sorts of different things, and all our struggles are they're interlinked, but there's a hugely complex situation there. So in terms of left and right, what are we talking about here, and is there any alternative to the traditional sectarian politics of Sinn Féin, DUP? I know like Sinn Féin are trying to move away from the idea of that and moving towards the left, perhaps. Am I getting that right? I'm going to stop talking now and I'm going to leave it to the experts, because I think I'm going off on some sort of weird tangent where I don't understand myself. So take it away, experts.
That's too many beers on a Friday night, Paul.
No such thing.
I don't know.
Who's going to take that?
I think, I think that it's quite difficult. I don't think it really goes as a left and right like it does, in England, where you have, the left largely being Labour and, etc. But I think there are splits between each, kind of the orange versus the green, in sort of religious politics. They have their own determinants within that, which could be seen as left and right. There isn't a particular left and right party, but there is one in the middle that's very like the Lib Dems, and that's the Alliance Party here. But they are, more of a, well, I suppose like the Liberal Democrats in England, more of a middle class kind of middle class party. But I would say that there isn't really a clear left and right, in the political sphere. It's more, as to say, the breakdown within each one. So you've got, people before profit, which is very small, but it is a a socialist, element on the Catholic side of politics. Is there really a left wing of in the Unionists? I'd be hard pushed to say.
I mean, I think the other thing too is, you can get kind of fixated on electoral politics, and miss the fact that that very often political progress takes place outside of assemblies and parliaments and in spite of them. So even the Alliance Party, which we referred to as kind of centrist Liberal Democrats, I think the Alliance Party is probably substantially a party of a kind of middle class conservatism, largely. I don't know. You would, a kind of one nation conservatism transplanted over here. There might be a few people from the Northern Ireland Labour Party were involved in it at some stage, but it's largely another concern. So our politics is overwhelmingly dominated by conservatives of one shade or another. But then you get sort of things like the women's rights movement here, pushing for abortion rights for women, LGBT community pushing for things there, an environmental movement. You come over here, we've got a great May Day demonstration, stuff like that. We've got, still trade unions working. So there's stuff that kind of happens. And I think sometimes, and again, I sometimes sort of think, and I'm a member of a party myself and we campaign for things, but I'm aware of the fact that when you're a member of a party, the objective is to get yourself elected, not then to try to change things. And maybe sometimes there's, you kind of, because you become so focused, not so fixated on it, you miss the fact that if you can redirect your energies into other areas and succeed there in making improvements without necessarily having to submit yourself to, 5-year cycle and that kind of short-termism that you mentioned earlier on, Tina, where you kind of think you can't think beyond the next 5 years and what's going to get you elected again. You can work somewhere else. And I'm not sort of saying it's entirely successful, but it is a possibility, and maybe we need to be more aware of it and not get too hung up on parliamentary numbers.
I would say, sorry, go on ahead, Sean.
I mean, the one thing missing in Ireland, North and South, that you would find in most of Western Europe is a Labour Party as such, like a mass working class party that has an organic link to the trade union movement. And that doesn't exist in Ireland, North and South. And that's for historical reasons, for the way two states have been set up and created. You had a conservative state and created in the South, and a sectarian state created in the North. In the South, the Labour Party really became a sort of, it's the most conservative Labour Party in Europe. That was, the third wheel in electoral politics, in terms of its subordination to the Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, the two main parties that have dominated Irish politics for a century. The Labour Party's always been a bit part, and from about the late 1940s, it made a sort of strategic decision to enter into coalition with one of the two big parties, and that's been the picture since. During the austerity period, Labour entered into government they did fairly well on an anti-austerity programme, and they went into government with Fine Gael, and they're subsequently wiped out, and they're never going to recover because Sinn Féin have swooped in, as I said, on the back of an anti-austerity message, on the back of a social democratic economic programme and message. And in the last election in the South, for the first time in history, a sort of left-right divide formally emerged, with Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, the two historic right-wing parties, finally agreeing to enter in the government together for the first time. And on the other side of the house, you have the opposition led by Sinn Féin on the basis of a social democratic programme, with other sort of clatterings of smaller lefter formations. In the North, electoral politics is sectarianized, and class politics has always been the victim of that. So that's a big missing piece, I suppose, in the puzzle. And I suppose coming back to the constitutional and political framework, whether the space would ever emerge within that framework for that type of class politics at the electoral level, I don't know. But I have to agree with Steve that there's a lot of good things happening elsewhere, at a community level, at a trade union level, and there's a lot of merit in putting energy into that, as a means of building working class institutions, building working class power, and influencing political processes. So I think that's going to be required, regardless of whether there's constitutional change on the horizon. It's necessarily regardless.
Yeah, I think, I 100% agree, with both of you. And I think, what I was just going to say was just to reiterate, what you've said, Sean, but Stephen, what you've said about, the fact that so many things can be achieved outside of electoral politics. And that's something that, I've talked about with Paul before, and I've talked about with, another of your comrades, Paul O'Connell, Sean, talk about it quite a lot, that, the experience, and I can only relate it to my personal experience, which was, obviously, being selected as a candidate during the Corbyn years, and seeing how the system within the Labour Party tried to, shut down any sort of real change that really could be made, even, as you correctly noted, Stephen, that the programme wasn't even that radical, that we were offering it, And as someone who was naturally an activist, and not a professional politician, I think I got caught up. I think it was, when I joined the party after the election, when the Tories came in 2015, and thought, God, this is the way to do it. And then you got caught up in the whole Corbyn moment and thought, right, we really can get change this way. And then, to come out the other side of that in 2019 and to have the realization that, no, we can't just magic the change from that top-down scenario of the electoral politics, that, it is going to have to come from, the outside. Yes, it does have influence, but unless we build it up from the outside and create those links within communities to, on the issues, to activists in other areas, and link things through from, as you build locally, you end up building nationally, and then you can influence the people that hold those positions, that make the decisions that then can affect the change for everybody. And I think that's why, I'm sort of more focusing on what maybe, the political parties in the North can do at that community level, and what they maybe try to inspire, younger activists to focus their attention on, and to become part of the change that does lead to the material changes in the North, but also the issue of, the constitutional, because it won't come from, it can come from people like, within the Good Friday Agreement, sitting behind closed doors and coming up with solutions. But I think the real, the lasting change, the way forward for me, for the North, is for people to be aware and part of those demands to get that change.
I think that's again, I think one of the reasons not to fixate on the electoral stuff, because in some respects, when it comes to the elections, you can have the best policies in the world, but if you're throwing them onto, I hate to get biblical about this, but if you're throwing them onto stony ground, they're never going to take root, they're never going to seed, and they're never going to grow. And I think that's one of the reasons why, and I think Trademark are, kind of pioneers in this in many ways. That's why education matters. Because if you don't begin to broaden people's horizons around where the horizon of the possible actually is, they're never going to believe you when you even come and sort of say, here's something we could do. It's very menial, but we could do this. No, I can't see that being possible. I see. I read in the papers just aren't. See, and your man who knows what he's talking about on the Mar show, he said that's not going to happen. If anybody watches the Mar show, and so there's a job of work to be done with regards to the education to begin to develop that kind of more fertile ground. But that education is also, I think, very, very closely related to questions of culture as well. Culture is that space in our lives where we make things meaningful for ourselves. And if we, culture and education are very, very closely linked. And so beginning to develop a kind of a consciousness amongst people that the horizons of the possible, are, greater than they perhaps anticipated. This goes back again to sort of things like the importance of Benedict Anderson, who you mentioned earlier on, who sort of talks about the idea of the imagined community. And he talks about it in terms of a nation. But socialism has to be imagined as well. It's got to have an imagination. It's got to be able to sort of say, this is the thing that we're striving to achieve. And that's educational work, and that's cultural work, and that's about learning through activism and being involved in those kind of strong. And I speak from the better experience of having been somebody who thought at one stage that these things here over here will work. This electoral path will work. We'll do this, that, and this will sort of work. And at the ripe old age of being middle aged now, I'm suddenly going, actually, that's all shite. That doesn't really work at all. We should have been doing this.
Yeah.
You enter in your anarchist phase, Dave.
Late life. But that's sort of thing. People sort of say they get more right wing as they get older. I think we just drift into the left. And actually, I sort of think there's much more serious work needs to be done outside of political parties, which in many respects is preparing the ground for those sort of political successes. But that ground hasn't been prepared yet. And we're a long way from it. And you can see it in terms of education. You can see it in higher education, which has retreated from the idea of thinking critically. You can see it also in terms of the media, or even the BBC, which had an elitist version of public service broadcasting, has retreated even from that into kind of free market and commercial thinking. In terms of education and culture, we're on our own here, and that's a problem for us over here in the north, and trying to imagine a better settlement than the one we have. But it's a problem for all of us.
Yeah. Oh, Paul, can't hear you.
All muted.
Yeah. So what I was saying is, I guess, sorry. My fridge is packed up and it's making this really weird noise. So I'm muting myself on this little microphone here. So that's why. I'm so slick. But so I
don't know if you saw me. I was waving my dog's standing here at the door. He's trying to get in now.
Oh, I tell you what, that's the best thing about live streams is it's the animals of the live streams. So I guess like from everything you've said, there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the situation in Northern Ireland, and I suppose like we talked about left-right politics earlier on, and one of the things, I had an interesting conversation with someone earlier on, and they were saying the Labour Party have moved too far to the left, and I explored it a little bit too far, and what he meant was they were undemocratic because they tried to overturn the Brexit referendum. Now that's undemocratic. That's nothing to do with left and right. That's just being undemocratic. But they have now, like, the Conservatives have owned that. They've changed the rhetoric, and I suppose like there's a blurring of lines between what people think left wing is and right wing is, and I suppose that you've lived that for quite a long time. This like where it's not really to do with left and right. So I think the final question, because we did say we'd kind of give it a cut off at some point, because otherwise we could be here for like, I don't know, 44 weeks, a 44-week live stream of the history of Northern Ireland and all the problems you've faced and stuff. So I guess like we like to end up on a upbeat note, I suppose. What can we do? What can we do? How can we challenge what these problems is? How can we learn from what you've experienced, and support one another as socialists, as people who want to have better lives for their own communities? Where can we go? And I guess like relatively short, and I don't expect you to solve the world's problems at the moment either. So don't feel too much pressure, because how in the world can you solve that one? But is there anything like small steps that we can take towards changing people's minds and working together as a working class communities? And let's go, Stephen.
I think in some respect what I said earlier there just a minute ago is that's kind of my last word on it. Really, it is. I think the importance of education at the moment is just huge, and the importance of trying to develop out of that education a kind of socialist culture, that becomes a kind of repository of meaning and experience and practice that people can begin to draw upon, because that's really very, very sadly lacking at the moment, and that is the ground that you will sow those seeds of policy on. So I think we need at this stage we need to be good gardeners, basically, and tend the soil. And I think that's the key.
I think for me, interestingly enough, the word, funnily enough, I thought this word was going to come up more in the conversation, and that's about tolerance. And I think that's maybe something, because, in the North, there maybe isn't a lot of tolerance to a lot of, issues. But I think, for me, I think, we're living in the world of, social media. We're living in the world of, everything, it's either, everything feels like it's become quite binary, it's either this or that. And, doesn't seem to be any space for the, the whole, everything's about the what's in between, and I think that, the left are very bad at this as well. And that's about tolerating other people's views that are so diametrically opposed to your own. But we have to be able to do that. And we have to be able to have the conversations with the people who really do hold views that are, completely disagreeable to our own, and to find a way to be able to talk and work through that and be able to come to, to a compromise in some respects. But the only way we're going to be able to win people around to the vision that we hold for society is to be able to listen and have those conversations and understand where the other side are coming from, to be able to bring them over more to, to what we're on. I think the other thing that I think I spoke about this whenever I was on before, Paul, is about community organizing, about, it's key. I think we've got to think locally. We've got to be, embedded in communities and build that sense of, and I'm not talking about, creating huge change, but even just something on your local, your street, something that can change, that gives people the confidence to know that in that collective that there is, a way to create the change that you need. So, I do think that we've got to be having conversations. I suppose it links to what Stephen's talking about education, in the workplace, wherever you are, having those conversations and talking to people, but then also that organizing element where getting people together to really, make a difference, and that then grows and becomes bigger and bigger.
After me, is it?
Yeah, go on, Sean.
Go for
You've
it,
got the final
Sean.
word.
Bookend the show as well.
Yeah, just to pick up on Steve's thread, I suppose, and some of the stuff that Tina has said, there's countless numbers of campaigns and community groups and working class institutions that exist in the North that are active, that are doing really good stuff. They're active on housing, on defending the NHS. There's anti-mining campaigns in Tyrone here, in the west, in the northwest of Ireland. There's any number of campaigns that are ongoing, and class-based community campaigns that you can identify. So, like, if there's anything we can do, it's to engage with them, promote them. Those are the types of campaigns. That's the type of politics that increasing numbers of people are looking towards, especially younger generations coming through here in the North. So I suppose if there's anything you can do, it's to talk about those and promote those through your networks, to identify those sorts of things that are happening beneath the surface. I think the thing is that they're not connected vertically, they're not connected horizontally with a progressive political context, but we can fight for the progressive political context and political framework at the same time supporting those sort of grassroots movement. And, like, of course, I'm going to echo what Steve said about political education. Like, that's our bread and butter. But those two things come together. Like, I mean, we're working with some groups in the border counties of the border counties, and particularly Fermanagh, out in the sticks, and we're talking like people are sick to fucking death about being told how sectarian they are. You know, they're increasingly turning to new politics, and the bigger sort of challenges facing us. And we're doing things like community wealth building and modern monetary theory and Marxist theory and all sorts of stuff. Like Steve's been down speaking to some of these groups as well, like, and it's brilliant. And as Steve says, that gives them the confidence, and that promotes a sort of class-based socialist consciousness amongst people who are already active in struggle. So if there's anything we can do, it's to engage with that and promote that, and that kind of thing.
There's loads of hope, you see. This is why we end on this question. There is loads of hope. There is opportunity, and I do feel hopeful. And I think, it's been a really dismal day. I think, when we look at the elections, and, I was having a conversation about that yesterday, and just saying that, out of every sort of catastrophe like this, a real failure, there is the huge opportunity for rebirth and create something new, but stronger, better, and the way to do that is exactly what Sean's saying, is linking up those things. It's all the things I think that we've mentioned, and if you link all those together, but you do have the solution. It's just it's just getting people together to do that, because if we could do it, we would all be doing it now, and it would all be amazing. But I do think that we are seeing, if we grasp the opportunity that we have, it's ours for the taking, really.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, thank you to all of you, and thank you so much for doing this. We will do a little debrief after we go offline in a couple of minutes. What I do want to say is, if anyone wants to get involved in Socialist Think Tank, it is absolutely free for any member to join. You can choose to contribute if you like, just stop us from having to pay like all extortionate fees and what have we, but we're not bothered. You get the exact same membership whether or not you pay for it. And I think the important message to come out of this is just like stick together, show each other solidarity, listen to one another, and education is massively, massively important. So I would just like to say once again, thank you so much, and I hope to hear from you all soon. You're all really welcome to come on the show anytime you want. Tomorrow we're going to be doing a debrief on the local elections, which should be quite fun. We'll go into the detail of Hartlepool and all other things, and County Durham as well, and we'll see you soon. And also we've got Luke Wenman from GRT Socialists, who's going to talk about Gypsy, Roma, Traveller, racism and everything, all the struggles they face. And it's an absolutely excellent interview. So we hope to see you tomorrow again. And take care, everyone. See you later.
Keep the red flag flying here.